Greetings, all. Hope you have made it through another week of this physical distancing thing that we are doing. And I hope you took the opportunity to practice some of the prayer disciplines that have been brought up either in the face to face Sunday school when we discussed things like the examen, or in the last video Sunday school that was recorded and posted on the website. If you found this one, then you might have been able to find that one as well. Again, this material, at least the Word document, the PDF that's attached with it, will be available to download or to open up to get some of what I've been going at in here. Next week will be our last in this Sunday school series on prayer. And initially, before everything else happened, sort of the expectation was we would be taking a break, be getting together with folks and doing some chime lessons and things along those lines. I'm not quite certain where I'm going at this point with stuff, as we're looking at moving stuff around or keeping things the same or whatever it may be. And that brought me back to revisiting, practicing the presence of God. We've done this. We practiced the presence, this idea of Brother Lawrence and the recollection, the bringing God to the front of our mind. Anytime we did a little something, whatever device we wanted to use to help remind us, whether it was standing up or sitting down or a clock chiming, an alarm that was set, whatever it may be, we would go about our business and then pause in that moment to bring God back to the front of our minds. And so I wanted to revisit that with a slightly different twist, talking about symbols and idols as elements to sort of help us in prayer. So there's lots of things that we can do. We have in the Sunday school group with prayer, we have done intercessory prayer and praying with our eyes open, where we received images of individuals that we were to pray for the week. And that can be a very powerful thing. We're just trained not to have our eyes open when we are praying, just like we were trained to look at someone's face, which makes recording these very challenging because you have to look at the little pinhole camera and not at the gabbing image on the screen. But images can be helpful. Tactile things can be helpful. Taste, smell, auditory cues, all of these things can help us remember. And this is what Brother Lawrence was pushing us towards, to remember God, to make God and the awareness of God, the alongsideness of God, to bring it to the front of the mind again. Well, that comes from not just sort of a desire to have a closer relationship with God, but there is a very basic human function that's involved here. All of us want to be remembered in some way, shape, or form. Some of us are even wanting to be remembered to the point where we're willing to sort of misbehave. So at least we'll be remembered for misbehaving, right? So we carry on in some way, shape, or form. We want to be remembered. We want to be remembered special times of year and things along those lines. Pardon me real quick. We want to be remembered, right? So there's product placement that help sort of bring up certain things. We want birthdays or anniversaries. The calendar is chock-a-block with special things. I remember moving out to Ohio and being introduced to a Hallmark holiday called Sweetest Day. It's 6 months opposite from Valentine's. It's functionally Valentine's 6 months opposite from Valentine's. When I was in North Carolina, we celebrate St. Patty's 6 months off from St. Patty's. It was an alternative St. Patty's or the other St. Patty's or whatever it may be. These sorts of events, they're memory events. They're fun in some ways. They're also commercial in some ways. Family holidays, get-togethers, the directories, right? There's things we do, special sorts of things that we get together, and we want to be remembered. We want to remember others because we too do not want to be forgotten. There are crucial times in life when we do not want to be forgotten. There's the old joke, you can call me late, just don't call me late for dinner. To be forgotten, and you'll notice some of this is being pulled directly from one of the texts that I've been using quite a bit, the Masson O'Donnell Spiritual Traditions text. To be forgotten it can be a very painful sort of thing. Now, sometimes we don't honestly want to be remembered with stuff. We would like to be left alone. We don't want a big deal made about it. Maybe we want to be remembered, just knowing we've been remembered, but not necessarily have a, parade with elephants and fireworks going off to remember us by. It's just the knowledge of knowing that someone thought of us. It's a really interesting book, and I don't have the title right in front of me. Patrick Ness or something like that is the author. A Brief History of the Dead or something. And one of the core ideas is, as long as you're remembered, right? As long as you're remembered, you exist in some way, shape, or form. The memory can be very short and fleeting. So remembering, being remembered is important. When we are forgotten, especially in connection with like major events and things along those lines, it's almost as if we're being told that our presence is not considered essential. And in a small way, it might feel like we disappear. We disappear a little bit. It's that, in some ways, it's that horrible feeling that a pastor gets when it's been about 3 weeks and we suddenly realize we have not seen somebody in those 3 weeks. They haven't seen them in worship. We haven't seen them out and about and things along those lines. It happens, and it's a horrible feeling in a lot of ways. And when you are sort of forgotten in that way, it can be quite horrifying as well, as if your value dissipates. It's as if we haven't existed. In the ancient world, this was taken perhaps even one step further, and we can say it's the case nowadays. I mean, you certainly could read books like, 1984, where history is being rewritten, and there's lots of folks that complain about it. History, just for me defining it at this point, is an interpretation of past events that is shared. That's what history is. It is an interpretation of past events that is shared. Now, it can be shared with yourself in the form of a diary. It can be shared with others. But that means it can always be reinterpreted. It means it can be erased and rewritten. We are finding that memory is not like a selection of photographs. It's more like a Word document. We can open it up and we can edit it in a lot of ways. But in ancient times, to be forgotten, well, it was in some places called dying a second death. And we have periods of this or examples of this. There was the famous Pharaoh Akhenaten, if I remember correctly, it was Akhenaten, tried to make Egypt monotheistic, worshiping just the sun god. And it didn't go very well for him. After he died, his name was quite literally chiseled from history. Any monument that had his likeness that they could get to, folks removed his likeness. He was blotted out. And in the ancient world, that was a major concern. You would be blotted out. Your line would disappear forever. You would die the second death, the ultimate form of annihilation. So we seek to remember, right? We seek to remember. We name things. We give money to have things named. We get bricks. We do all kinds of stuff to make sure that our presence on this earth is in some way remembered. We have markers, quite literally. And we have other things that sort of prove that we were present. This is a very human sort of thing. And I imagine that we then project this onto our relationship with God, which is why it's so important that we do the recollection activities that we do, that we practice the presence of God. Because while we ourselves are maybe afraid of being erased, God cannot be erased, but we can certainly forget God's presence. We can forget God's role in this world and the way that God acts in our lives. And so we draw on objects, right? There's objects that are connected to faith. There's objects connected to our own lives that are used to remind us, right? We imbue these objects with power almost, and I say objects, but it could be any sort of thing that kind of it stirs something within us. It connects within us. It points to something beyond itself almost. I mean, think of a stop sign. The sign in and of itself is not going to stop your vehicle. I've seen enough broken stop sign posts to know that the sign itself is not going to stop the vehicle. It points to a larger idea. It brings forth a memory. Ah, I see that shape with those colorings or that pattern and that collection of letters or what we define as letters on it, and I know I need to stop my vehicle, at least for a period of time. Now, where I grew up, we had a form of stopping that was just sort of taking your foot off the accelerator and honking the horn as you rolled through. Not the best thing, but these symbols point to something larger to them. It brings forth a memory. It draws us beyond the symbol to something else. These are key objects. They have been given authority that in their physical being they don't actually have. Like I said, stop sign, not going to stop you in a vehicle. I've seen plenty of people on bikes get stopped by a stop sign, and I may have run into one or two myself while not paying attention during a stroll. Things that point to something bigger than themselves, an idea or an ideal. There are other things that trigger these memories that bring to the front, that bring up feelings. There are sights or sounds or smells. There are tastes, smell being a very important one. There's auditory things. I will always have a feeling, a memory that is connected to the overabundance of Easter flowers and Handel's Messiah, the Hallelujah Chorus specifically, in connection to the church I grew up in. So I smell those flowers or I hear that piece, and there are things that come then back to the front of my mind, and I can very viscerally encounter them again. I can remember the tickling of the nose that comes with the smell, and the way that the heart is stirred, not just with the music, but with the community of faith that is gathered around the music. This symbol, in some ways, has become an instrument of recollection, of bringing something back forward again. Of course, the danger is that any of these sorts of things that we have can become objects of worship in and of themselves. We can begin to believe that they have certain power. We can believe that the stop sign is actually going to stop us, and we begin to act as much. It's gone from being maybe a place of faith where the symbol points beyond itself to the thing becoming an idol of worship. One of the most eye-opening things we got to do in school, and there was a book that was connected along with it. It's on the shelf there somewhere, but I don't know exactly where it is, called Practicing Our Faith. Anyway, we were supposed to spend time with an object that was very precious to us. And I was thinking, how am I going to decide what's precious object-wise to me? And I started thinking about what I spend most time with, and I ended up spending time reflecting in front of a TV set that had been turned off. I had given a lot of power and authority to that TV set. And even though I wasn't actively worshiping it necessarily, there was no incense being burned in front of the TV set, no sacrifices made other than the gift of time that I was routinely handing over to the TV set. So in some ways, it did become like an idol. Scripture points to these sorts of things and whatnot. And so we have to be careful whenever we are talking about symbols and practicing the presence that these objects don't then become objects of worship. That is taking us away from God instead of pointing us on to something larger. The thing becoming the focus, that's a problem. But when the thing points us to something larger, and specifically in our context points us to God, then this is a way of remembering in a very profound, positive, moving, and realm-building way. And so there are many objects we can use as we are practicing the presence of God. This is the shift from before. Instead of using motions or activities to call us to time to sort of think about God, we're going to be picking some objects. Now, we could be using artwork, right? There's icons that are out there. I've got a whole collection of icon calendars that I'm looking to turn into various hanging works of art. So there's all these sorts of things, pardon me, reminder just came up, all these sorts of things that come up that we can sort of get into. But what I want us to think about is a different sort of object, a different set of things, a very specific Christ-centered, Christian-centered object or objects that then help us remember, bring us into the presence of God in a very meaningful way. And for us in the Christian church disciples and in a lot of traditions within Christianity, the most profound or one of the most profound objects that we have is found at the communion table, right? So there's all sorts of things within church that can draw us to God. We have scripture that we read, and we have the actual building itself that's been prayed in, and other sorts of things that draw us toward God. But really, when it comes down to it, the chalice and the paten, right? The emblems of bread and cup. I don't actually have the bread and cup sort of, or the juice and the bread in this case, or wine, if that is your fancy. But these objects can be very powerfully meaningful as far as directing us back to God, helping us recollect and be in a place of worship. Now, you probably don't have a chalice like this. There's two that I'm aware of in the United States at this point. One is with me, and the other one is in North Carolina. They were special ordered through a wonderful pottery group called the Painted Peacock in Aden, North Carolina. I gave them a task, and the first one they weren't happy with, so they created again, and I am pleased as punch with this particular object. But I bet if we looked around our homes, we would find perhaps other things that could be used as chalices in some way, shape, or form. We might actually find that we have other pottery chalices or goblets available to us that we can make use of. We certainly might have a special coffee cup or two, or 7, that we can use. It is about the emblem, the thing that points. And so if the coffee cup doesn't do the job, if it's not pointing you, like this is a Hiram College one, it's not going to really point me to God in the necessary sorts of ways. So maybe that's not the best one for me. I happen to have a few that have crosses on them that might be fantastic. I've got a really nice chalice a friend brought back from Jerusalem. It says Jerusalem on it. So those sorts of objects can be helpful. Patens is, I mean, it's literally just a plate. A paten is just a fancy name for the plate that the communion bread goes on. But you might have other plates. If you do not have a cloth napkin that you believe to be appropriate, use a paper napkin, use a kitchen towel. I've used all of these things. But what we want to do is to actually have the emblems physically present. Now, I understand some traditions, and perhaps even some within the breadth of the disciples' tradition, hold communion slightly differently than, we all hold communion slightly differently, what we believe it to be, right? There's a huge spectrum. And so for some folks, this idea of having the emblems present might call to mind the literal transformation of bread and cup, or bread and juice, or bread and wine into something else. It might be more of a spiritual transformation, or a figurative transformation, or a pure remembrance. What I'm asking, though, is because we celebrate Eucharist at the center of things, communion at the center of things, is that we, through this week, find a way in our prayer practices to have the emblems in some way, shape, or form present in our lives, right? Because this is very much at the center of who we are and what we do. These represent crucifixion and resurrection. These represent the forgiveness of sins, the grace and the mercy of God. These are very tangible symbols. It's not just something we can see. We're not just seeing the cup and the patent. If you actually put juice in them, and you might not want to leave it for very long, it could get a little strange. You might not want to leave the bread out the whole time, or you might. And every once in a while you go by and you can, now we have the scent of the bread or the scent of the cup coming into our space again. We are seeing it, we are smelling it. Or one of the most profound worship experiences I had when I was in Indianapolis was being in a chapel that was very live acoustically, and it was an Episcopal worship, and so they had the styrofoam wafers. Um, and the priest, when he broke it, there was an audible snap. And think about where the breaking of the bread takes place and what it represents. And then we have this snap taking place. I now have that in my ears and in my memory. And so it could be that the hearing of a snap is now bringing that Eucharist experience to mind, and it's drawing me to God again. So we can, I've got the ears, I got the nose, I've got the sight. Obviously taste it, go ahead and sample it, right? Because it's bread and cup. We don't want it to go to waste necessarily. You have the feeling of it. This is one of those symbols that touches on all of the senses, the physical senses of the human body. And it points to something so much larger than just bread and juice. It points to something so much larger than crackers or wine or whatever we might be using to help orient us toward God. If it's a remembrance, it calls us to remember. If it is actually something that is spiritually transformed or literally transformed, it is drawing us, it is connecting us. We are imbibing in that way and being united. And all of this should bring us to prayer. I'm not talking about every time you stop by, you sort of, drop to your knees and pray. You feel led by the Spirit, then all means do it. But what I am talking about is that recollection, right? The bringing God back to the front of the mind, because the Eucharist, the meal experience, is something we partake in on a regular basis. Having these sorts of things physically present and remembering how central they are, not only to our faith as followers of Christ, but to life in and of itself, to consume and to be fed and filled and nourished in that way, in all the ways that we consume food and beverage and whatnot. So let those symbols draw you, and then draw you closer to God in prayer, in practicing the presence in this week. And the next part of that is because we don't table fellowship on our own. While we are not gathering together in this point in time, as we do table fellowship, there's lots of folks are doing like Zoom happy hours and whatnot. Have the emblems present. It might make you feel a little uncomfortable. Well, that might not be a bad thing, but have the emblems present. Have that reminder there. Call and check in on people. Maybe you'll see the emblems and the community of Christ will come to mind, and you realize, I haven't seen so-and-so, or I haven't talked to so-and-so in so long, and reaching out. In some ways, that is prayer. That is part of what we are doing as the realm. And so that is our prayer practice for the week, the practicing the presence of God through especially the symbols of bread and cup, okay, of the Eucharist experience, for these are central to who we are as Christians. And that is what our task is for the week, okay? Next week when we get together, we will be looking at the Lord's Prayer, actually, spending a little bit of time with the Lord's Prayer, prayer that we often know, but we don't necessarily do a lot of delving into. With all that in mind, I pray you all the very best in the week that is to come. Please keep checking in on things, keep checking in on each other. Facebook, the website, lots of stuff happening, even if we're not happening together at this point. Anyway, let us close in prayer. Almighty God, you are indeed present in all things. We are drawn to you in many ways. We are especially drawn in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup. The emblems that your Son set aside for us and called us to take part in, the emblems that connect us across time and space, O God. May we, in perceiving these and tasting them and seeing them and smelling them and touching them and in hearing the sounds of them, may we be drawn to you more fully in this week and drawn to each other. We ask this that you may be glorified, and we ask it in the name of your Son. Amen.